And we're live. The Technologist podcast. Welcome viewers, welcome listeners, people on LinkedIn, people on YouTube. Welcome to the chat. If you're here, please let us know. We'd gladly receive your questions. My name is Dennis, and today with me is Nik Sumeiko. Nik, welcome.
Hi, Dennis.
Did I get the pronunciation correct?
Perfect.
Nik Sumeiko. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge a person that is very dear to me. Today is my dad's 70th birthday. So Dad, happy birthday. I just wanted to get that in because we've been looking forward to this.
Happy
Nik.
birthday to your dad, Dennis.
Thank you, Nik. Nik, you seem to cover a lot of topics. On your profile, it says philanthropist. You inspired software enthusiasts on TDD and craftsmanship growth. You have a very tight focus on TypeScript, specifically with React. And you're in banking and payments. And you're a father and a husband. What is a good place to start to figure out who Nik is?
Well, I think it would be worse to talk about the environment that I work within and live within. I'm originally not from Austria, not from the Central Europe. I'm originally from the north of Europe, from Latvia, a small country there. And well, the life there is not that superb like it is in Central Europe. And when I moved to Central Europe, I just realized that I could help some people in Latvia. And there where philanthropy started, together with my wife, we were trying to contribute and to donate to sick kids from my original country. And this is what we are doing and continue doing. But yeah, if we look at work environment, I'm working at the bank and we are handling payments for people. So we directly influence the society. We help to manage their money. And this is, for me personally, this is a breathtaking responsibility because you can deal with people's money with a material which is very sensitive. So you cannot make trouble with your software, with your digitalization with this. You have to enable people with tooling that actually enrich their life, that allows them to manage their money, to use their money as they want, and never have problems with that. Therefore, with this, we come to the point that, okay, how to achieve such a quality of your software that it never, let's say, breaks, that it always serves people and never distracts from their tasks, And there, the clean code, the TypeScript, the test-driven development comes very handy. Because the demand of quality is actually dictating you to pick the best approach, the best technique to use to ship good code.
So there is it's beautiful, Nik. So the underlying reason, perhaps motivation, inspiration for you to use TDD, it all is all grounded in a social contribution and ethical framework of I'm delivering software. The people I'm delivering software to care about this product. So I should do my best to make sure it's working as well as it can, especially because it concerns their money. And their money, $5 to somebody who's using my app might have a much stronger connection to those $5 than I do, whether it's to their $5 or to the amount. Is that a prerequisite? If I tie it perhaps clumsily into a topic of craftsmanship, is this level of social contribution and ethics a prerequisite to doing TDD and testing well, to sort of push for more discipline inside the software delivery process?
It's definitely not a prerequisite for this. For me, just a motivation, this impact that we can create on people's life by enabling them to move their money as they want, let's say, drives me to use this technique because it helps me to guarantee better software quality. But in general, if you like software craftsmanship, if you want to be better with that, you have no boundary. If you don't maybe create such a lot of impact on people, and you work in maybe some small company that does some maybe routine work, helps some back office stuff, it doesn't mean you cannot start with TDD.
So if you're teaching somebody new, perhaps your children, when they start learning coding, programming, where on the curriculum would you put TDD? You know, I learned programming, you know, at the age of 6, and I was just doing things. You know, there was a very doing oriented approach to writing code, and I was the tester. You know, I didn't write unit tests until I was, you know, well into my career. Where would you put TDD into the educational spectrum now? How early?
I would say the first stuff that definitely makes more sense to learn is the foundation of the programming, so computer science. The next step would be to mature the knowledge of your chosen programming language, for example, the foundation of it, how it works in detail. And only on top of that, you then add test-driven development. That's the best setup, I think. Otherwise, if you jump on test-driven development without having foundation in some computer science and foundation about your programming language, will be tough. You will drop soon.
So how much, when I spoke about this with Valentina, she also advocates clean code and clean architecture, but more so on the organizational and backend side. You have a very strong front-end focus, or perhaps even an exclusivity to front-end focus regarding technical craftsmanship as far as React engineers are concerned. What are some of the unique challenges that are front-end specific that you've tackled?
Testing of front-end code is in general a challenge because you involved UI, and that's an environment, and testing it is not so easy. And therefore, actually, testing, I would say, is the main impediment, understanding which tooling and which type of test to use to what kind of use case, let's say, because it's not straightforward that you just can have unit test and test everything with that. In React world, in UI world, it's not that case. And if we look at testing pyramid, something like this, you know, that normally at the bottom of the pyramid in React world, I would put unit testing. So all the business logic in a sense of if conditions, loops, data transformations, data retrieval, usage of out-of-process dependencies like calls to API, for example, all this is business logic. These shall be tested using unit layer, unit tests, okay? The next layer in the pyramid could be an integration test. That's a test we normally could do with React testing library, where we could assemble together some components and see how they work, you know? These tests are not that fast as unit tests, obviously, but they add a lot of value if you want to test a component without booting the whole application or the whole browser altogether, you know? So normally with integration test, we test use cases which are like edge cases or which are not a happy paths of the user, you know? And then almost on the top of the pyramid, this is end-to-end testing, you know, where we normally in React would tackle happy paths, exactly to simulate the most closest environment user goes through with end-to-end test, because end-to-end test is booting the whole browser, putting all application together, and then clicking on the path where user normally goes, let's say, to submit a payment or something like this.
When
this is a pyramid that I would go through, and this is like the setup where a lot of people in React world have troubles, I think, to identify what type of test fits what type of case.
So I'm really glad you brought up the pyramid, because from a backend perspective, learning TDD is very much unit oriented. Like you do TDD, especially if you do it with the correct cycling, especially if you do it with pair programming as well. You have this very rigorous approach to like just cut it down to a minimum. When I talk about this to front-end developers, their eyes usually glass over and they become bored because they immediately push away this notion that there is such a thing as a unit, because they immediately, at least from my conversations with full stack and front-end engineers, there seems to be a belief system tied to, well, I never control the unit because the code isn't even running on my machine. The code is running on God knows what browser, on God knows what hardware, on God knows what device, somewhere out there in God knows what right to left and language specification. And there's the network layer actually delivering the code and then talking to another server. And the unit is something that the user is doing right now. So they load up the website, it downloads, it processes, it creates a JavaScript environment, and then it has a state, and then within that there is a unit somewhere. And they immediately just go, no, this is too complicated. It's even too complicated to get to the unit, so I'm just going to do end-to-end tests. And that is complex and challenging, and then they give up. So they get to the stage of, what is it? A little cheat sheet, conscious incompetence, where they say, okay, I get it. It's super complicated. It's always going to be super complicated. I'm not going to do it. And you seem to help about getting to the next stage, because here, most people give up here. Most people, they don't know, they learn it, they get to this point, and then they see, oh my God, this is super complicated. There's the whole network layer and browsers and different browsers. I'm going to give up. How do you bring a dev from conscious incompetence to conscious competence of saying, no, yes, it is complex, but there's a solution. And here's how you deal with this mess, the complexity.
Yeah, well, by role modeling, this is the only way how I see it, by showing that it's not that hard if you do it properly, if you pick a proper testing type for a proper use case,
So you use the word use case. Are we talking about the capital U use case word in the clean architecture sense of the usage, or more like a BDD oriented use case terminology?
More like clean architecture use case.
Okay. So how would you recommend devs pick their types, the testing types, big to small? What are, let's say, a few examples, just to get the vocabulary across to our viewers?
Well, obviously, in your application that you are shipping and building, you have this happy path that user go through. If in my case, by example, would be payment form where user submits a domestic or international payment. So these are already two use cases, which definitely fits into end-to-end testing, because they are crucial to the business of my company. I need that they work, therefore I pick the best testing that is closest to the user environment. He will go end-to-end, will boot the browser, and will do everything. The same what user does.
And the business, and it's such an important feature to the business that the business will immediately notice that it doesn't work, whether the users will complain or there will be an immediate reaction on the bottom line, on daily revenue,
yes,
etc. What about smaller things? When I was starting my career, we had this idea that, okay, let's have backend devs and front-end devs and a designer, and then we'd create three artifacts: the backend code, the HTML, and the JavaScript and the CSS.
Yeah.
We followed that path. I think the whole industry followed that path for like 5 to 10 years. And then that line became muddled, first with Angular, but then heavily with things like Tailwind and styled React components. So that there's a huge emphasis on style now. Would you test, what is your recommendation when there's things like, when I press this and this, and there's an error that the button should be red? To what level of granularity do you involve that with business logic and, let's say, important use cases?
Well, so we have a design system in the bank. The design system is a set of React components which developers can consume to assemble pages, views, and so forth. And this design system is tested on its own separately in regards of visibility and accessibility, whether in certain state the button is red or the button is blue, whether it's accessible or no. These are all tests are done by design system in our case. And if you go to like that level where you want to test an edge case, because again, displaying some error or disabling a button in certain state of the application is not super typical flow that the user go through. Maybe the user made a typo when he put some recipient information like IBAN, international bank number. Maybe he failed there, and then you need to display the error message underneath. This is an edge case, and this fits to integration test. The test that runs much faster than end-to-end, but still gives you confidence that something is working or something got broken. So at the end, for each case, you think about the following: whether that's relevant to your business 100%, then you put the most closest to the environment test you can. Second, you see, okay, you want feedback fast. You know that end-to-end is the slowest test possible. Therefore, why to do everything with end-to-end? Because you will wait for your feedback a lot, you know? You want to get feedback fast as a developer. If something
you're
is broken,
spinning up or mocking complex systems.
So you pick a
databases.
different test still, which will assert your case, but give you a feedback much faster because it just runs faster, you know? And this is, I think, the criteria which you have to rely on to decide which test to pick for which use case.
But you already mentioned something and we're talking about George here, right? So the way George is set up from your answer, from the beginning of your answer, there seems to be a very strong separation of concerns regarding the part of the React code that is functionality, part of the React code that is sort of local, like micro tactical sort of view changes, and then the part of the React code which is purely presentational and design oriented. Did I get that right?
Yes, correct.
Well, what is your recommendation to somebody who is not in such an environment, for whom their app, to their current level of craftsmanship, to their current level of understanding of the code, has all of those three things in one, or perhaps, perhaps just two? Maybe the presentation is a little bit everywhere, and there's maybe some kind of flux or some state store mechanism on the front end, living as a sort of fake backend or middleware, or GraphQL is getting quite popular nowadays. How would you, what is your most pragmatic advice to somebody who is not in, let's say, a perfect environment?
Don't overcomplicate until you have a pain.
Don't overcomplicate until you have a pain. That's interesting, because Jonathan Hall had a similar sort of advice when I asked him, what is something you got told early on to do that you changed your mind on? And he said, don't test everything. Don't try to get 100% coverage and then go through the pain of getting fake coverage when you don't have the pain of the system not working in the first place, or when you don't even have that level of complexity that you would need that much coverage.
Yes. I agree absolutely with that. I think it would be very useful when technical people like software engineers, like I am, could identify the business value, could be aware what is actually the business behind what we are programming, and understanding this would give a clear guidelines of what shall be really bottle tested and what shall be omitted for now. So we as engineers don't just purely put code in place. We are helping the company to build a business, So I think this is interesting concept how to look at that. So you are a stakeholder of your company, let's say. You participate in building some software to earn money or making business at the end, okay?
In the context of React specifically, React is a very opinionated framework. I have a bias. I'm primarily an architect and backend engineer, but I dabble with React. But when I look at React, I look at it from the perspective of a, let's say, backend developer. You know, I don't necessarily draw a hard boundary at the transport protocol like a front-end engineer would. You know, it's like, oh, you know, there be dragons. Past Axios, there be dragons. But when I look at it, you know, it's very opinionated. It comes with its own build system. It comes with its own testing framework. It comes with its own language. It comes with its own language transpiler, common practices, best practices. How much of what you do is actually Nik's style or the Erste Bank process culture, and how much of it is actually just the React tooling? You know, what is the, for you, in your experience, from your current project, what is the best combination of those things? Because you don't seem to do it by the book React way. You have a more benevolent approach to testing from a business perspective. Yeah,
exactly. Since we have more than 1.5 million lines of code and more than 40 front-end developers just maintaining that part of George as a digital banking of Erste Group. We have our own, let's say, problems on that scale.
I can imagine.
Yeah. And oftentimes the documented or opinionated approach that we could read online doesn't fit, because many people maintain that, because tests can get very easily coupled with implementation, and then developers will spend their minutes every day to maintain the test when software behavior didn't change. Brittle test, let's say.
Brittle, yeah.
But we want to make our developers productive, and therefore sometimes we need to go beyond the recommendation of what you see in documentation of React, let's say, or best practices of React.
So,
and there computer science helps at that scale, at that level. Or test-driven development also unveils you the problematic parts. You try to write a test in front, an integration test, let's say, and you see you cannot without mocking something.
Exactly. And then you need to get in, you need to interfere with the unit you're testing in order to test it.
Precisely.
Before you have the test.
And this guides you that something will be wrong with the design of this.
Exactly.
Because already test signals me that the test becomes brittle when I write it.
So do you mind if I interrupt you here?
Do it.
Because you had a very good post today. So for our viewers that don't know it, you had a test today regarding testing a React component that is TypeScript safe. So it is fully type safe on the component side, and it does a request to an API endpoint in order to show an error message for like a error path. So it's not the happy path. And you raised two very good points there. One is to abstract it correctly so that you don't actually, so the thing you're mocking is not tied to the implementation of the thing you're testing, because then it becomes brittle, fragile. And when the business requirements change and you will change the test will fail. And if the business requirements don't change and you refactor the test will also fail because it's testing the old implementation. So it has two levels of anti-patterns tied in there. And you posted a very good solution to that. But that first thing you mentioned is very strong. It's a very strong signal to a developer. It's very emotional. It's like, I'm testing this thing, so I need to treat it like a black box. So if I treat it like a black box, I can't go in and pull out Axios and mock it. Unless I give myself permission to do that, in which case the developer is tempted to go all the way, mock everything. And then what I see with a lot of junior TDD practitioners and even senior devs who just aren't that test savvy, they then have a huge net of mocks that fully matches the symmetry of the implementation code.
Yes.
And then they're just testing their mocks, essentially. Not even the implementation, they're just testing the mocks.
Yeah.
What is, and I'm sure you've seen this. What is, if this is a problem, if this is a, let's say, bad habit, how do you undo this bad habit? Where do you stop this bad habit from reoccurring for a developer who might be doing this today?
It's also worth to evaluate, like, okay, how much productivity do you lose as a team or as an individual to maintain such a test with more brittle tests, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe if you have just, you know, a dozen of tests and you refactor something, your software behavior didn't change, the test failed on false positive, you could spend a minute to update its mock so it's green again. Maybe it's fine at that moment, but at the scale we have, where we have dozens of thousands tests running in place, it's just very inefficient to spend these developer minutes to maintain these mocks, okay? And when you see this pain in your development flow, then this is the time to rethink your design. Rethink that, okay, how can I make this design decoupled? How can I make
What does that mean exactly? Decoupled from a front-end perspective. What is it that you're decoupling from? From a React component level, right? Are you decoupling from like the store that it's in the middleware? Are you decoupling from the request from the transport layer, or are you decoupling from the design? Are you decoupling from the sort of opinionated structure of how the React routing system works, and then how the asynchronous calls are being and the state is being handled? Where is the coupling topology?
For example, I would give an example with API adapter, the transport to the backend, you know. I want that my React application is decoupled from the transport in a sense that it doesn't have a direct dependency. So I don't import, let's say in JavaScript language terminology, I don't import the API dependency inside the component, inside React component. Because if I do, then I have this tight coupling and it's hard to test. So I need to introduce some middleman there.
And when you say API dependency, we're talking about front-end code that feeds the React component with data.
API dependency is something that interacts with the API.
Okay, on the front-end side.
API adapter on the front-end side.
Okay, okay.
It fetches the data, it mutates the data in the API. So it makes an API request. Yeah. This is what I call API adapter in the front-end discipline.
So this is something that can be using fetch or Axios or connecting to GraphQL, or be sending mutations, a post request, handling them, doing cores.
Yeah.
So this is something that you would define as a seam. And when you're testing, you would have a hard boundary across this seam. Like you would not mock across this seam. Okay.
Yeah. So this would be, I think, a good example of having loose coupling where it adds a lot of value in that. And then you can separately test the API adapter itself, because it's just a unit that is using out-of-process dependency, a request to the API, as you mentioned, Axios or window.fetch, any mechanism. So you could unit test that separately, and then within the whole application, when you assemble it, you don't anymore go to the API. You fake it, you know, but you fake it not by mocking. You fake it by registering a dependency in your middleman. In the React word, middleman would be React context, for example.
Yes. So
and
the data
an abstraction. Layer. Yeah, an abstraction if you look at dependency inversion principle. And now this abstraction is something you could depend on. So your implementation, your component now can be dependent on an abstraction, but not really on implementation. So this kind of stuff decouples.
I've seen this, and then I've seen this year, last year, the sort of TRPC community pop into life. Are you aware of TRPC and sort of the T3 stack that Theo is working on PinkGG?
Not much in that.
Because and it's very similar to Next.js as well, but Next.js sort of does it differently in that it sort of renders the whole application in the backend partially, and then it sends a partially rendered artifact down to the client, and then hydrates it with JavaScript that allows it to change its state, but it's not rendered from stage zero, state zero, but it's rendered already from like a very active state, and then it's just being hydrated into future updates, which is really interesting. So it captures a sort of server-side rendering aspect to it. What I wanted to ask you about, to not derail the conversation too much, because it's super fascinating, Nik, regarding the scenes. Because when I test backend code, what I like to do is I like to have like a really, I wouldn't even call it a mock, just a fake, just a fully implemented fake of the front end. And then when I'm testing, the way I'm keeping the unit tests and the integration tests on the backend side strong, so they don't break. And the representative of use cases is to have like a very slim, what would you call it? A shim maybe, or just a fake about what the front end is expecting, what sort of terminology the front end uses, what's a menu, what's a sidebar, and to have a fake front end for my backend testing. And it seems like what you're doing is you seem to have like a fake backend for your front end tests. That is very different from, it doesn't go through the transport layer, but it mimics some level of full functionality of the backend system. And perhaps GraphQL would be a fully production level implementation of this fake. And there's some complexity to this. So how would somebody start this? If we're doing TDD, let's say, what is a natural way for somebody to start this? Would you recommend that they get a book and start doing it from like a coding cut and from a tactical perspective? Maybe start implementing these fakes into their system, or to identify the seams more from an organizational perspective? What is your recommendation? How to start TDD on front end?
A great question. So I don't want that any people who have a willing to learn TDD start with this fake or dependency inversion principle or any other computer science approach, because it's not easy, not super, let's say, natural. This natural way, the simplest way how to start with TDD is to think when you write your React component, when you put JS6 syntaxes in that, and at some point you realize that there is demand on business logic. So you need an if condition, for example. You need, for example, to evaluate some data. For example, conditionally render a component, okay? And you need to render a component if something is in that state. So when you come mentally to that need of business logic, abstract it separately. So don't write this logic first, but create a small unit test for that. Create a picture in your head, the function that you need that will evaluate. For example, I need to conditionally render international bank code in my form only when user enters international IBAN inside. So it's conditional rendering in React. I need to evaluate what is the IBAN, whether it's international or it's domestic of the country where we are. So this evaluation requires business logic. And I create a small unit test, something like I imagine a picture, I imagine a function that will be called something like is IBAN international, and then it will have an argument which is IBAN, and then you write a test, something like, okay, it returns true when IBAN is international, it returns false when IBAN is domestic, for example. And then step by step, you write it, you document your business logic in a form of small tests, you know? And when you write such a small test, then it's read because you don't have any implementation behind.
Yeah.
You started with a small test. So then create a service function or utility function or helper function. Developers call it differently, this layer. And within that function, try to make your test green. So import that function that you created in your test, run the test in the watch mode, and then start coding. As soon as you made such a small test green, go to the next one. And for example, returns false when IBAN is domestic. That could be your second test case. And then continue this way. So starting with unit level is the way to go. That's what my message is.
So start off with the unit level. Just write a test, capture an if statement, capture an exception, capture some fork in the code, write a test for it. Rather than going hack it together with the implementation testless, write a test for it. Write a test that represents the green case, let it fail, and then go and implement it. So at this stage, there's no React logic in this test. This is targeting the unit level, is targeting something beyond the front-end framework.
Yeah.
So that would be you called it the service layer or the business layer or the use case layer or utility or helper function.
Yeah.
So this is something that is just business code, something that would perhaps represent or mimic backend code inside the context of the front-end execution environment.
Yeah.
So this is something of the equivalent of user logged in, is user logged in, is user authenticated. So wherever that if statement lives, get it out of the React component and test it separately.
You already mentioned, Dennis, so this already gives a lot of benefits thinking this way. As soon as you start with a small test of that particular if condition, this immediately drives you to have a separate concerns. Your React view and your business logic are now separated. So this already gives you a benefit from design. It drives your design. Because if you would not start with this test in front, you might put in line the if condition. You know, if IBAN is international, then conditionally display the input field.
The input field differently, yes. So the input field might have different limitations, or it might be two input fields, or but that's very bank specific.
So I think it's like starting with just unit level already gives a lot of benefits. Changing your mindset, learning how to think in test, formulating your business behavior in a form of test. So writing this like, okay, what is the description? What the arrangement of the test? What an action of the test? What an assertion of the test is, you know? And then thinking, okay, if this is a test and it's separate from my React code, then also implementation will be separate from my React code.
That brings up a very important point, like if separating implementation from React code, because for a lot of people, their React code is the implementation. When I'm talking to full stack, I won't generalize that much. When I'm talking to front-end developers, specifically front-end developers, there seems to be this, I don't know, it's very human, I think. It's a very human reaction of acting in the way of, you know, well, am I the front-end developer implementing the front-end because I'm following business requirements? Or am I following the back-end requirements? Or is the back-end requirements following me? You know, so is there a sort of lockstep that has to happen in tandem regarding, you know, is there two input fields because that's the business requirement? Or are there two input fields because that's how the API behaves? You know, so there's this level of maybe human team-oriented coupling where if the backend developer is sitting next to the front-end developer, I can guarantee that separating an abstraction between them is very unnatural. Whereas if they're in different offices on different continents, that might be very useful. So there is immediately what I would say either a Conway's law element to this problem of if you're the full stack developer and you have an input field and you can change the backend for your input field, then you will have this tendency of, wait, hang on, if I'm writing a fake frontend for my backend test and a fake backend for my frontend test, every code I write, I will have to write 4 times. Because I will have to get the real one on the backend, the fake one on the backend, the real one on the front end, and the fake one on the front end. So there's obviously a precondition here to not get too busy and overwhelmed, right? So what are those preconditions? Is this advice just for front-end developers, or perhaps a team where there's a certain level of separation and hierarchy going on?
Ideally, it would be that most of the business logic is handled by, of course, backend, because it's faster. The environment of the server is controlled by you. And
but it's clumsy because you wait for trivial validation, right?
Exactly, yeah. But the transport, the request to the API also has its cost, you know. That cost is speed in the most cases, you know. And sometimes it works to do some business logic evaluation of something on the front end if you can, especially related to the user input, you know, something that is not yet available for a backend for evaluation. So yeah, but in reality, actually, it's not like that. The discipline of front end is now so developed that that React actually came because of that. We are now dealing with rich internet applications made on the client, you know, and therefore all this complexity comes in. Because remember back the days back then when there were no front-end, let's say, applications as they are. Backend was sending HTML back and it was just rendered on the page, and JavaScript was decorator element was
and even before that, even with just the HTML, I remember what was it? File Planet was this huge network for computer games where they had a menu in the sidebar, and when you open up the menu to expand it, it would refresh the entire page. Which took 20 seconds, you know, on a modem, which is bizarre. But now we're doing a lot of backend equivalent business logic on the front end.
The complexity of front-end application became dramatic. And I think therefore the demand on React developers or front-end developers as a whole is so huge, because businesses want that we serve applications which are fast, which are smooth, asynchronous for the user, so user feels comfortable. And these tooling frameworks, they enable us to do this.
What about not mocking it? Would you recommend that? Like, to what degree would you implement a fake, or just have a full, you know, if you're using Kubernetes, just have the backend API spin up in fake mode rather than have a fake adapter on the front end? What are the trade-offs? I've seen both done. I would like your thoughts on like the do's, don'ts.
If you have an environment that will be stable, that will not produce you false positives on your, let's say, end-to-end test, just do full end-to-end test. So interact with your real API, with your testing API, let's say. That's beautiful of that. Unfortunately, at least in my experience in different companies, even before the bank, the environments are not that stable to hold the end-to-end always. Therefore,
stable in the sense that the orchestration gets in the way of actual behavior. So if I'm faking Stripe or a bank or authentication, there's already something that breaks. In some case.
Therefore, it makes sense to fake the requests in this setup. Everything is about productivity, everything about speed. If you get a wrong feedback from your test, you waste your time analyzing it. If you have a setup, have an environment which gives you the most value. So the test gives you the most value, and then this is brilliant.
So to expand on this idea of productivity, what about DevOps practices? So continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous delivery. From the context of, you know, you mentioned you do 4.5 payments per second, and we have 1.5 million lines of code, 40 front-end developers. How long does it take for you to find a problem on the front end, on the application, to identify it and fix it and redeploy it? Can you share some metrics on that? Like, what is a good metric to have on that?
Well, we run we develop code in the form of pull requests, and every time we create some new change list, it's being first reviewed by a human a bit. So the syntax is reviewed, maybe design is a bit reviewed, and so forth. As soon as it's in place, and also as soon as the pull request is created, we have continuous integration set up in a form of actions that immediately run tests on your change list, And there we run integration and unit tests, which takes less than 20 minutes, I think.
20, okay.
So running dozens of thousands tests. And so you get immediately feedback from this automation if something doesn't work as it used to be, and you could continue working on that. I believe if you would have less tests, then it would run much faster.
So much faster.
Yeah. And then, of course, end-to-end is our, let's say, slowest resource, because we have also a lot of happy paths and they are covered with end-to-end. And there you have to wait. And therefore, normally we run them at the night on the latest main branch, and during the night they run. In the morning, we have a report. If something broken, that's our priority to fix. And this is how we maintain the zero bugs policy, if you ever heard about this term.
Yeah, zero bugs policy.
Yeah, so we have this automation that helps us to very quickly, as soon as possible, identify potential issues. So we can tackle that before we go to production at some point,
So is that more in the sense of chaos testing? Is that mutation testing, or is it just a suite of fully abstracted business requirements that you run the deployment artifact against?
Yes, the second one.
Okay.
So,
Nik, to perhaps tie up the conversation on TDD, we got a question in chat, and both questions are sort of aligned with this topic that we're talking about now. So Vitalo asked, a function like that would be separated from the component, right? Which is what we spoke about earlier. And he pointed out something important, is that when you have a rendering logic, so the if statement that you spoke about earlier, about writing your first unit, how do you test it properly if the rendering logic is based, and there's the service layer, if the rendering logic is based on an if statement in the service layer, and the service layer requires information from the backend to make its decision? So there's this triangle going on of I need the answer, and then I can make so there's an asynchronicity to the if statement. I think that's what Vitalo, if I got that wrong, please let me know.
To answer that, well, that's, I think, exactly the case where we want to fake the request to the server with some quick output that will be provided in the test. So if you have a unit which interact with API, by API interaction, I name out of process dependency. You test it as a unit test. You test that there is this request, there is this input, and there is this output. But then you assemble a more complicated test, which could be, for example, React testing library integration test, where you put together the whole component. You fake the API request in your test arrangement. Then you try to render your page with React testing library. And then the initial state could be something is not rendered because the API that gives this output. And the next state could be something is rendered because the API is in another state.
Because the API is in another state. Okay, so that's abstracting away the if statement from the states that the component can be in. So it's abstracting the way the component, the piece of the code infrastructure that's making the decision, or rather that's computing the decision.
Yes.
And to address that, because I think that really touches a topic that is quite difficult especially for React developers, is to what is a good guideline on how to pick the fully synchronous, promise-based, or something more reactive, or more channel, or subscription, or observable-based, if you're coming from a more of an Angular space, so that they're a bit more reactive. There's promises, or maybe some asynchronous dependency inversions with like stores or Flux. Should you enslave your middleware, your business logic that is not React specific, to some React specific asynchronicity manager, some observables or some promises? Would you keep it purely just pure synchronous? How do you make those decisions?
Well, you have some state in React applications. You can manage that state using different tooling. Okay. And this state will store your API data that was received or mutated or whatever. And this state has current snapshot, and the snapshot it will be after the change of the API. So you have the current snapshot, let's say, with this API state, and when the API changes, you have another snapshot. Yeah. And this snapshot kind of gives you information how to prepare the fake in your test.
But would the service layer that you're faking, would it be coupled to React? Would there be a level of dependency inversion where you would abstract away the idea of having a store, of having a state manager, of having something that is a state, or something that has hooks, or something that has use state, or something that has API queries or GraphQL mutators inside React? Like where do you draw the boundary of whether or not the business layer that you're unit testing, how much of React it can know?
Nothing.
So that was a hard line. No React code.
Business layer doesn't know React.
The business layer on the front end
should
not know about React.
Yeah, this is also useful if at some point you want to migrate it or to reuse it by some other application. If you couple the business layer with React anyhow, then you have unreusable business layer, let's say. It's working only within React environment, but you might at some point of evaluation of your software or of your company needs to use the same business units in different place.
And that I think is the hardest lesson for front-end developers, because when they open up React documentation, it's a framework, and the framework will always be opinionated in using as much as the framework as possible.
Yeah.
And to make your project as much about the framework as possible.
Yes.
We spoke about this with Valentina as well, regarding C# and entity framework, and the way the .NET is opinionated. Even if you're doing hexagonal architecture and clean code and clean architecture and inversion principles and domain-driven design, it is still very easy to fall into the trap of, oh, the framework does everything, so I will make my project the slave of the framework rather than a tool that I'm using to deliver business value.
Yeah. Where clean code architecture comes in handy, exactly. If you look at least a diagram, which Uncle Bob or whoever described,
about
you will see the separation of concerns in these onions, for example. You will see the separation of concerns, and these could be helpful when you're looking at React application, because yes, it's naturally when you read documentation online or see to put everything together. That's a path of least resistance for us front-end developers to do this.
Yes.
But if you want the coupled code, if you want the code that is easy to maintain, and if you really have a pain already with maintenance, with testing, with this, then it's time to separate your concerns. Then it's time to think about responsibility, what model does what responsibility and so forth. But again, it doesn't fit everything. In startup mode, it may be not a way, because in startup, you evaluate quantity over quality. You need to validate your idea as soon as possible. And maybe all these all these additional code that you need to add to separate concerns, to write proper, to have proper testing, useful testing, it's just not worth it at that moment.
And the more you resist it, the more the problem will get worse. The more it will persist. So Vitalo had a follow-up. We also have a second question. Chat is very active today, so thank you everybody in chat. So Vitalo had a follow-up specifically on this example of, if we're layering out, if we're spreading out the business logic layers on the front end side, the go-to pragmatic approach to reading documentation is to open up React documentation or open it up on GitHub, ignore the documentation and go to the code example. And the code example will always be extremely highly coupled, right? So that is the most pragmatic way of doing something new, but it is also it's a bad habit regarding clean architecture, because whatever you copy will be extremely framework specific.
Yes.
Because the only way they can make the example small is by putting as much of the example as possible into the framework.
Yes.
So that inherently, if you're copying from Stack Overflow or if you're copying from code examples from the documentation, it will make your whole application fragile because it is highly coupled to the framework rather than the other way around.
Precisely. So the point is, I understand why they do it, because it's just simpler to visualize the particular technique or approach that that framework can handle. The point is, for front-end developers, is to also learn the fundamentals of programming. Don't focus only on framework, which is currently on hype. React,
Angular,
Vue.js, and whatever you name it better than me. And also try to build a fundamental knowledge about programming, computer science concepts, learn about that, solid principles, for example, object-oriented programming, maybe functional programming. At least you are aware of these fundamentals, because as soon as you are aware, then you would challenge the code that you see in documentation. Then you will understand, okay, this is tightly coupled code they give me. This doesn't work like that. Okay, for example, it's fine, but it will create my system too much dependent on
the framework.
On a framework.
It's EDD. It's example-driven development. You take the code example, you copy it into your application, and then you try to adapt it.
Or SDD, Stack Overflow-driven development.
It's Stack Overflow-driven development, exactly. But a lot of developers program like this because the React and but one of the most complicated things a React developer has to learn is how to make a calendar. Calendars are really complicated, and then nobody wants to learn that, and then they just use a calendar plugin or a calendar component that they just download from somewhere. But there's millions of them, and it's not worth their time and productivity to learn how it works. So they open it up, look at the example, and then if they can just paste the example into their code base and it works, they move on, because it is not primary to their business domain. They just need a calendar on the UI. So there's a lot of that, and I think Vitalo's follow-up question really touches on this, because he says he has a request that passes through a Redux data layer that is then adapted with hooks that gets the data from Redux and provides it to the view that is then the render logic. And he says he can see a way to decouple React and make it in a way that is easy to change for Vue, for example. Or are we just talking about external libraries? So if I understood you correctly, you would take whatever is in the hook and yank it out and put that in a React agnostic code layer.
If possible, yes. Try to put all the business logic, if conditions, loops, data retrieval, data transformation away from React environment, away from
the component itself, from the JSX, from the
away from React component, away from custom hook. Put it in a utility layer, in service layer, in helpers layer, you name it, and then consume it inside your React.
So whenever you have a function that represents an if statement or a function that represents some kind of state mutation, get it out of your component.
And consume it inside the component. So component.
And consume that rather than the request that the function needs to compute.
Exactly. So your React layer, your Vue layer, or custom hooks that, let's say, handle some events that user clicks the buttons or so, it's more orchestration,
Mm-hmm.
more a sequence of execution of some functions rather than if conditions or so.
But that's very complicated because for a lot of React component logic, there actually is a sort of almost inorganic, two parallel, like almost two threads. Like I'm doing a request and I want to know what the new state is.
Yeah.
But there's also a read render for while that request is fetching. So something unique to front-end code is this idea that we also have to render that temporal coupling of the transport is in transit. And if you abstract it away clumsily, that is very difficult to set up. And I think only now, with the latest version of React fully embraced having asynchronous promises within their state update protocols inside the framework itself. I haven't done a lot of research on it yet, but I think that's a really big thing. Because up until now, most of your hooks, most of your callback logic had to be synchronous. So it was very difficult to abstract away, at least for a mid-level or even senior engineer that has very little experience with TDD. It's very difficult to abstract away this idea that, well, yeah, I have a function that is an if statement, that is my business layer, but I need 3 return values. I need it's fetching, was there an error, and what is the new state?
Yeah.
That is very difficult to model. It is not a trivial thing to model. Do you have a recommended library here that is not React specific? Do you have a go-to approach, maybe a style of coding? Do you have code examples that maybe people could take inspiration from?
To manage these API requests, there are different approaches. One approach could be to have a custom hook plus a mechanism that will do a request. For example, Axios or window fetch or so. So in custom hook, you have a state where you put your data in, and this state contains the error, is pending, and the data that retrieved from there.
So the state is the inversion of the component. The state object is what helps you not have the component in the function.
Yeah. And
that is the inversion.
The API request itself, you abstract into your service layer, for example, and then you make this API request, which is a synchronous operation. And only when you get the response, you update your state. And since React is reactive, it will see when state is updated, it will render your component. And based on these 3 parameters, error is pending, state of the API request, and the data that arrived, you could then render what you want and how you want it. This is like when you do it on your own, but there are tooling like React Query from the latest, for example, or React some other tooling also that handles this actually for you. And
I think it's just a new one. It's just use effect, and then the hooks and React Query, and then the GraphQL mutators as well, which sort of which handle this kind of, transport business layer protocol.
They are already open source abstractions for you to simplify that, to do not have your own state set up and so forth. And they help to speed up development and that. And we are using that also in our application.
But you have a big application, right? You have a big application that changes a lot, and there's a lot of regulation involved.
Yes.
So for that, Vitala, thank you for your questions. Please let us know if we covered what you were interested in. There's also the first question from somebody. I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce your name, so I'm just going to call you Mr. or Mrs. Kingsley. They were asking what metrics can they gauge their sort of testing maturity? Is it coverage? Is it line coverage? This is now my interpretation. How would you say, just by looking at it, like a litmus test for, we are testing our React code. What is sort of an intuition for, these tests are good, these tests are fragile, these tests are just blind coverage, and these tests are actually really good, that they speak a lot of business use cases? how would you, what advice would you give to somebody who's introducing TDD into their project? It's been a few months now, and now to give them some kind of protocol of saying, this is good, this is bad, what to watch out for.
If we look back to our pyramid, for unit level of testing, the lines coverage, all the branches, logical branches, make sense. So I would go with 100% coverage for unit layer, where you have business logic, domain logic. This would be a measurement for a starting point. When you go into integration layer or into an end-to-end layer, it's more you look from a business perspective. Okay, are all happy paths that user go through have test coverage in end-to-end? Are edge cases which are not that important as happy paths but might happen covered with the integration tests? So this is how I see the value from there. So on beyond unit, I don't see any analysis of whether lines were covered or whether handlers were covered or something like this. It's more related to the business value, whether you cover your business value. If you yes, then well, you are in a good shape.
You have this really succinct approach to regimenting down your testing scenarios to this pyramid. And I really like that. So you said test coverage, like hardcore test coverage, only on the unit layer. Don't obsess about coverage percentages on the integration and end-to-end layer. And then afterwards, if you have important business logic that is perhaps difficult to test, just make sure it's covered, but then don't obsess about, again, the branch coverages. Just make sure that you have the green path covered, the happy path covered, because you want to know when the happy path stops working. Because then when the happy path stops working, you don't deploy.
Yes.
And then that's useful for continuous integration. Because a lot of developers, when they do test last, what I see is they implement it, and then in a state where it works, they test the failure scenarios, which is not useful, which is never useful. Because then you will only know, oh, that scenario, when I know it breaks when I refactor, of course it will break because my tests are brittle. But the test that you're really interested in is the green, the happy path one, because if that one breaks, we don't deploy. And then it creates this, Uncle Bob talks about this a lot, is that your tests are only as good as long as you trust them. Once you have tests that you trust and tests that you don't trust and tests that sometimes fail and sometimes it's a false negative and it's sometimes red, and then you start bringing in this human intuition into, well, yeah, that one test out of 1,000 failed, but that one test can fail, it's okay, we still deploy on a Friday. That test should not be in your system. That test, you should eliminate tests that are like that and only keep the really important happy path tests in that will prevent you from deploying.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to have tests that are useful.
And you trust them.
Yeah, and you trust them. By useful, I also mean that. I think Vladimir Korikov, in his book Unit Testing, he defined very clearly what is actually efficient test. An efficient test is that protects you, just like you, Dennis, just mentioned. If happy path fails, I want to know that as soon as possible so I can fix the stuff. The good test is resistant to inner changes, the changes of production code. So such a test that will never break when you refactor the production code, but software behavior didn't change. So you want the test never break when software behavior didn't change,
when the business
but the underlying code
change
it. Yeah.
So you want the test. We spoke about this with Valentina as well, where once your business cases become more specific, once your tests become more specific, your implementation needs to become more generic, and it has to have an asynchronicity to the tests in order to match back to the business cases. It's an anti-pattern if your unit tests match every function name and every class of your implementation. So if you have like user component and a sidebar component and a navigation component and a bank statement account component. If you have a user test, a bank statement test, a navigation test, and a sidebar test, then that is already a signal that your tests are brittle, because you're testing them too much against implementation and not against the use cases.
Look again at the test as a documentation, and test is the best documentation that could be, that you could form.
Like a code example, even Uncle Bob talks about this a lot. Like, it is the most real code example that somebody can take, and at least in the test, it is documented to work well, as long as the test passes. So
if you, in your test, document the name of your class or a function or React component, you name it, that's a button or that's a link, that's a whatever other component, you may immediately couple this wording with what is implementation of your production code. And this immediately will signal you that you will waste time updating your documentation when you change the button to a link, when you change a link to some other element, and so forth. You
split two components into three, or to separate them out.
Exactly. So you will have a problem that you have to maintain the tests when the software behavior didn't change. So this is not a test that is resilient to changes. This is brittle test, just like you mentioned. You don't want that. You want the tests that have business information description, let's say, rather than what the structure of the code is. Okay. And if you have such a setup, then you don't touch your documentation until the behavior of your business changes. Only then you maintain the test.
So you don't touch the documentation, in this case, meaning the test name, the test structure, the test symmetry, the test shape, until the business requirements, the use cases that you're actually testing changes, not the implementation. Because it's a very easy mistake to make. So when you're testing your implementation, if you're testing something called a sidebar, and the sidebar has a pop-out menu, what do you call that test?
You could definitely use sidebar, but it doesn't mean that the sidebar will be a specific component named sidebar. It could be.
I know, but it's an easy mistake to make, to couple it immediately, and then. So in the absence of business requirements, you don't have a good solution to this. Like, you need business jargon. You need business jargon.
Terminology,
You need terminology that the business people use to say they don't know what the sidebar is. They just want the user to update, to verify their residency. Right? So you have a test for bank. So, sorry, viewers, we're talking about Nik works on banking software. So all of our examples today will be banking related and fintech related. So residency verification, that's what you would maybe call the test from like a business perspective. And then that test has, okay, well, the sidebar has to work because I need to be able to go to my account, and then the account has to show when I last verified it. There needs to be an upload flow. And what you're testing is residency verification. You're not testing the sidebar, the upload form, the
Exactly. So I would like here to reference a bit to my colleague Pavel Mokan, who is expert in BDD, behavior-driven development. We are not talking about business language or terminology. We are talking about user language and terminology. So how the user assumes that. So user wants to change a residency. That's it. That's the acceptance criteria, we have to follow.
And that's TDD.
But acceptance test, this is already technical detail. What is there behind? A sidebar where you update this residency, a form where you update a residency, a button where you update a residency. That's already technical detail. And it shouldn't be documented in a test, TDD, acceptance test, in a language that is technical. So you better use user language. So I want to, let's say, are you familiar with Gherkin syntax? Given, when, then, probably, right? So this would be the acceptance, documentation of acceptance tests. Like as a user, I want to update my residency. When I open a certain page, then I see an option to change my residency. What kind of option, whether it's a drop-down, whether it's a select box, whether it's a free text form, it's a technical detail. I see an option to update my residency.
So would you naturally infer the testing shape, the shape of the tests, the symmetry of the tests with the BDD references, and to sort of extract them from there? Because, you know, if you're a front-end developer, you don't necessarily talk directly to the end user. So doing any kind of event storming or domain-driven design principles, at most you can either talk to your business analyst, to your product owner, or to somebody or some form of UX professional or designer who perhaps has some connection with the user. It's very rare for a front-end developer to be directly talking to the end user about, hey, how do you interpret this button? Yeah. Unless they're working in customer care, which I really recommend for developers to be in touch with users for this specific purpose. So what is your recommendation for how a front-end developer or a full stack engineer gets exposed to more user terminology, more behavior terminology? How do they get more of that into their system?
Teamwork is a key here. When your business analyst,
who to go to? Yeah.
Which
roles?
Go to your PO, product owner, go to your business analyst, sit together with him. He has business requirements that we will implement, let's say next sprint. Sit together, discuss why it's there, what he wants, and so forth. This will give you already a lot of understanding. When he, let's say, documented, or you together documented the acceptance criteria of new business requirements that you will implement, go with a tester, pair with a tester, do a pair programming session, and try to write together the acceptance tests, let's say in Gherkin's scenario, given when them together with the tester. Or integration test, even with React testing library, try to at least formulate what you want to test, these use cases, you know, together with the tester. This will help to reduce your bias of being technical, because tester or business analysts, they are not developers. Yeah. They will point you, okay, you are too technical there. User doesn't know
what does that mean.
What does this mean? You know, you know, but user doesn't, and we have to document it more close to the user. So I think teamwork unlocks and enables you to grasp all this information and to reduce the bias of being too technical.
It's very good advice. Thank you, Nik. Thank you, Nik. So we covered testing, we covered naming, we covered use cases, we covered the business scenarios, a little bit of DevOps, and for beginners, how to start. Specifically for React. Is there a piece of the puzzle that we haven't touched that's really important?
I think really important is to find, let's say, a guide, find somebody who will help you answer the questions, because TDD is not natural for us. It inverts the typical, the familiar programming flow. How we are familiar: write code, then write test.
Yeah.
Okay. Now it's inverted: write test, then write code.
Think about solution, implement solution. Yeah.
When you write test, it actually helps you to think about solution, and so so this unfamiliar flow, which TDD occurs, it takes time. It will lead to questions. So you need people, you need mentors, maybe in your company, maybe outside, maybe me on LinkedIn, who could help you to answer these questions, especially at the beginning. Otherwise, you will drop just because this is new habit.
Exactly.
And making habits stick is not just one-day business. You need to systematically contribute. You need to have a willing environment and action to actually get there, to make the habit stick. It's the same with TDD. And then you will realize the value. But you need somebody who could help, who could guide, who could mentor, who could answer, who could release your doubts when they appear, At least for me, this is very helpful. In my company, I have many mentors, my colleagues or colleagues from backend also, which I ask questions, a lot of questions, which I try to challenge them thinking like this and this, and out of this, I extract a lot of knowledge. Or the same when I share information on LinkedIn, I get a lot of comments people are discussing, and this gives me useful insight and information. This gives me opportunity to get better. So don't think that you are alone. There is a community of developers. Ask on Stack Overflow. Ask on LinkedIn if you have people you follow. Ask your colleague at work. Ask your colleague from different department, backend developer maybe, if he sits nearby. Brilliant. If he's in another country, write him a message. Ask questions that are important to you when you start TDD, and these will help you to move on. You are not alone. There is a community of people. Just don't be ashamed to ask questions.
So it's beautiful. It's beautiful because when I look back on how I learned testing and TDD, there was always somebody else involved. There was always somebody. Dennis, you're testing, but it's weird. It's synthetic. There's too much mocking going on, or maybe the test itself is not congruent enough, and then doing TDD and it becomes rather unintuitive. So there's something very habit forming in this practice, right? It's this. One of my mentors, Pete, he likes to say that it is the difficult part is building the myelin. It's that element of frustration where I'm gonna do it, but it's frustrating, and the learning experience comes by pushing through that frustration. If you give up when it becomes most frustrating, you go back to old habits. And building that myelin is very difficult because there's an element of sort of almost fitness workout to TDD. It is a very how would you say, it is not immediately gratifying, but it's a huge investment into the future, because you will have tests written for the code that you haven't written yet, and that's extremely valuable. Plus, if somebody disturbs you and you're doing TDD and you're writing a test every 5 minutes, your code was stable 5 minutes ago. That is, especially on front end, that is extremely valuable. I've seen countless times where somebody started refactoring some button or some panel or some view, and in the process of refactoring, there's a problem, or there's a meeting, or there's an emergency, or there's a weekend, and they find a problem, they start debugging, an hour turns into 2, and now the view is not deployable. And now they go on a branch because they haven't finished yet. Now that feature branch becomes stale and long-lived, and now it becomes this huge problem, right? And TDD prevents you from going down that road. And it's very difficult to have that discipline of, no, I'm going to do, I haven't written a test in 40 minutes. I'm debugging something silly that I don't have a test for. Maybe I took a too big step. Let's revert and try again. That takes a lot of discipline. And I agree, like having mentors, having somebody there with you, sitting next to you to observe this is really helpful. To, hey, Dennis, you've been debugging this for 40 minutes. You haven't written code. You're just changing stuff and then running it again. Write a test. Write a test that captures this behavior. Implement minimum. Super valuable.
So TDD brings a lot of value to the table you mentioned. Beyond, I wanted to add this. It's an investment, obviously, in the quality of the software of the company you are working with. But it's also a personal investment. Learning this makes you invaluable player in any organization afterwards. Learning test-driven development enables you to work with this even when you switch the language from JavaScript to Python, PHP, whatever,
Java,
and
C#
you will still
it's
be
universal.
and you will be able to ship the quality software. So it's about you first, about you personally. if you want to become better software craftsman, TDD is one of the paths, one of the multiple paths. So you invest in yourself first, and obviously the side effect will be the quality of the project you work on at that moment.
Beautiful. Because that's, but the hard thing is, the hard thing is where to start. If your company does not do TDD, it might be difficult to be the black sheep who starts doing it suddenly, right? Because you will slow down. And then you will be the black sheep who's trying something new and now slowed down. And you'll have this temptation of stop doing TDD because everybody else who's not doing TDD is at least temporarily faster than you. Or perhaps there's just this perception of it. So I like to, on these kinds of problems, I like to reference a quote from the book. I need to check my cheat sheet because I don't remember it off the top of my head. So from the book, The One Thing by Gary Keller, which is the golden question. And the golden question is, what is the one thing that I can do that, subject to doing it, would make everything else either easier or unnecessary? And then this will help you identify where you need to focus your efforts. So if I raise the golden question as a developer inside an organization that's working on React, that doesn't do TDD, what is the one thing I can do to make all of my TDD related problems easier?
Start and then show to your peers. As soon as you start, maybe with this simple example, abstracting your business logic into separate layer, then approach your colleague to do a pair programming together for an hour and show him next time you do this. And what confidence it gives you when you assemble your code, design your code this way.
Beautiful.
This might inspire at the beginning.
So it requires inspiration. It requires a leap of faith by somebody to start doing it and be the example.
Yeah, it requires an inspiration the most at the beginning, because just like you mentioned, you don't see the gratification quick.
Yeah. And that is okay. Whoever is doing TDD right now and they're thinking, should I stop? Am I doing it wrong? This is okay. You're learning a new skill.
Yeah.
It'll take time to develop. And you're on the right path if you're feeling frustrated, because it is difficult. It is not difficult, perhaps, but there is an element of workout to the tactical side of it.
Yes.
Okay. If it becomes too difficult, I imagine they can reach out to you in a more formal relationship and to have you come and help them out. What does this look like? An engagement with Nik, and Nik teaches a company or a team or an individual TDD. Who should reach out to you? What are you open to?
Absolutely. So since test-driven development and shipping software that is quality, 4.5 payments per second, without a trouble is my deal. Inspires me a lot. And yeah, then I cannot omit sharing it online, and therefore I built this workshop for engineering teams, for people who do React development, front-end development, to role model and enable them test-driven development, to show them the value, how test drives the design, how test gives you confidence that what you ship is predictable, it works, So I built this workshop for teams, and currently it's an on-site, offline workshop where I go to the office of the team, and together we try to practice test-driven development and so. But I see the demand on LinkedIn, at least, that people individually wants to try this, and I'm already working on enabling this workshop in some shape online, so it's possible for people online to join in some manner and work with me together for a few hours to figure out how TDD works and to get the concept and then try to transition this knowledge into their current projects. Okay, so yeah, at the moment, engineering teams are available for a workshop that I offer. You could find it in the featured section of my LinkedIn profile. There is a link with all the detailed instructions and details. For the private people who are in developers community, soon we will have something for you that you will benefit from. Just stay connected and follow up.
Okay, beautiful. And of course, all the links, even if it's of a future thing, will be in the description. We will update them in the future. So if you're looking for it, it might either be up here in the corner or down in the description below. And I would love to help with that. You know, I'm setting up something now as well. I'm bringing a little bit of elements of life coaching into the sort of the craftsmanship of being a software engineer, because there's a lot of frustration involved and a lot of limiting beliefs, a lot of I can't do this, imposter syndrome. So I'm setting a cohort-based workshop for that as well for next year that I'm developing now. But I am looking for something just very simple, very one-on-one, or maybe a filmed craftsmanship, you know, TDD, just how to extract language, you know. I joke about this on LinkedIn about the thesaurus, you know, like have a dictionary at hand, because when you need to name things, when you're writing a component as a sidebar, maybe sidebar is not always the best option to name your tests or your enveloping abstraction layer that sort of, you know, what is the user doing? Like you need terminology for this.
You know, that is, to quote another of my colleague, another of my mentor, Klaus Polanka, he always says, what are two the most complicated things in software development?
Naming
the first one is naming, well, then three. Naming, cache validation, and dependencies.
Dependencies.
Yeah, managing dependencies.
Do you have a particular strategy for managing front-end dependencies? Do you limit yourself to the build process that React comes with, or do you have like a second stage build process built on top of the non-React code that you
we are using several tools. We are using CodeScene tool. This is similar to Sonar Coop, if you maybe have heard that.
I've heard it, but I haven't used it yet.
That analyzes your code and visually shows you dependencies and problems, potential
and it's TypeScript
problems.
specific. It requires type safety, right? Because that sounds there's coupling involved.
No. Both doesn't require you have TypeScript.
Okay.
So they visualize the problematic parts, they visualize problematic or potentially problematic dependencies, and help you already to think how to tackle that tech debt at some point. And another useful tool is ESLint plugin that identifies circulation within your code, circular dependencies. So it can immediately analyze your code and see whether you have some circulation there and warn you about that, so you try to resolve this. So these two tools are useful for our flow.
What could you repeat the first tool again? The name of the first tool?
CodeScene.
CodeScene.
Yeah.
CodeScene and ESLint. Okay. Yeah. I think most people are familiar with ESLint. Mostly for
ESLint has a specific plugin that tracks circulation, that
I see.
the dependencies graph.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, Nick, is there anything else you would like to share? Any topic we haven't touched on? I think we're now slowly coming to a wrap. I'm just going to check in with if we had any unanswered questions. Mr. or Mrs. Kingsley also asked linked in the YouTube chat, are there any materials like PDF you can recommend for testing front-end applications? And Klaus Polanka, your colleague, is in the chat as well. Hello, Klaus. So regarding materials,
there are various books already written which are really good, which are named Doing Test-Driven Development with React. You could look on Amazon, for example, for that, or another book which is called Testing, I think, by Vladimir Korikov. This is a superb book. It's not related to JavaScript language or any other language, let's say, as such, but it gives you a very good concepts on testing in general, which are applicable to any language afterwards. Specifically
regarding architecture, so clean architecture or hexagonal. So it sounded, what we were talking about today about abstracting away, from React, that sounded very hexagonal. Is there a book you could recommend that just covers the design aspect of, separate out from, the framework that you're using? Is there a book that helps you?
For React, no. For React, no.
No.
I don't see any. I don't have any resources that would try to apply hexagonal, clean, or onion architecture on React. This is what I'm interested to do.
Yeah.
This is what I'm sharing on LinkedIn in the community. So
I'm doing that as well for the backend side, especially for CQRS and event sourced systems, or transitioning, recovering monoliths. Which is very interesting because this space is very unintuitive, and the same way that hexagonal and the same way that TDD has an element of unnatural, there's an element of discomfort or pain involved with, wait, I need to change my thought patterns in order to rethink how I'm developing software. That's very difficult. There's also an element of that when you're doing hexagonal architecture or onion architecture, because you need to rethink of, oh, wait, like the most pragmatic approach is to use the database and to use the request protocol of the web, but those are actually just transport layers. I should really be focusing on my business, and the business is just pure code. And if I don't constrain it, if I don't draw hard boundaries and small boundaries, the solution space becomes so large that I can easily get overwhelmed. And then I just start, taking the shortest route. And the shortest route in that state of overwhelm is always tightly couple the web protocol with the database. And it always leads down to messy code. And I see that happening as well on the React side that you mentioned, where it quickly becomes overwhelming if everything you do is inside some React component, and then you need a React component to abstract away a function call to somewhere else, and you have these synthetic non-rendering container components, and then you're connecting the produced HTML with some API, and then your mess in between just becomes this shortest path that becomes a complete mess. And it's very unintuitive to not do the simplest, shortest path.
Yes, I agree. Well, if I may maybe end this from my point, our discussion today, would be nice that we think that we are together, that we are a community, that we can help each other by sharing knowledge online, by answering questions or asking questions. So I encourage everyone to join some kind of developers community that fits. In my case, I'm in React developers community, where we are talking about React and so forth. And this is what my interest is. This is where I could be useful, where I could help. And this is where other people could help me. So you are not alone. We are all together online. You pick your channel. I'm on LinkedIn, for example. You pick your channel that it works for you, and let's do it together. Let's learn together. The common knowledge is a wisdom. It helps really a lot, me personally, dramatically.
That's a beautiful way to end the episode, I think. So, Nik, thank you very much for coming on. This was a beautiful conversation. This is something very uniquely challenging and inspiring, especially regarding craftsmanship, on the front end, which I was really excited to talk about to you today. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your contribution to me now as your host, and to the community in general, and to the philanthropy, and to your users. To our viewers, thank you very much for staying with us. Thank you for all the people who collaborated in the chat. If you found any useful aha moments, please leave a like or subscribe. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.